What's up guys, in this video we'll be looking at spin orientated rackets in the 98 square inch range. Currently we've got the Babolat Pure Aero VS, the Yonex Vcore 98 2021 and the beloved Head Extreme Tour. Additionally, I would have added the Dunlop SX Tour 98 but couldn't personally justify the price of the frame and no demo is available for me to get. These rackets look to provide a resemblance of the kind of spin that you'd expect from their larger 100 square inch counterparts, but perhaps with a little bit less power and a little bit more control. If you enjoy the content, please like the video as it helps with building the channel and making new content. Most rackets I have I will personally buy to test for a couple months before ultimately deciding whether or not I decide to keep or sell it. Subscribe to my channel for more racket reviews, and if you want to support my channel in any other way, you can go to buymeacoffee/AC Tennis, which I'll be using the funds to get more rackets to review or upgrades to the channel. Special thanks to those who have already helped me out. And also you can check me out on Instagram to give you an idea of what's to come. Let's move on to the specs. They are all classified as 98 square inch rackets. The Vcore and the Extreme Tour sport a 16x19 pattern, whereas the VS has a unique 1620 pattern. Each of them have an unstrung weight of 305 grams, therefore their strung weight should be similar, around 323 grams depending on what string you use. Likewise, all of them average roughly the same balance point at around 6 points headlight or 32.4 centimeters, and the swing weight averages show that the Extreme Tour comes in at the lowest of around 318, the VS a bit higher around 321, and the Vcore being the highest at 325. The Aero VS is the stiffest of the bunch at 67 RA stiffness, then the Vcore at 66 and the Extreme Tour at 65. The beam widths are varied, but none are particularly outlandishly thick, and this is what you typically would expect from a more controlled model variant. With string setups and modifications, pause the overlay to look at what I experimented with. The ones highlighted in the green are the ones that suited my game style the best, which is a fast whippy forehand with a one-hand backhand, aggressive baseliner that relies on a big serve and a big forehand to set up most points. Moving on to feel and stiffness, the VS is a stiff racket. Anything about 65 stiffness RA can be generally considered moderately stiff, but this also depends on how well of a dampening technology is used. As many issues as I've had in the past, my arm and wrist do hold up pretty well to my surprise using the VS. That could be a different story if you use stiffer strings or higher tension. For what I listed that I used, it's bearable enough, and surprisingly I haven't experienced any problems yet, and actually less problems than the other two frames. Though it's a muted racket, it also provides some satisfyingly smooth feeling pinging sounds and doesn't sound typically like a muted thud like on other heavily dampened frames. The Vcore 98 I would describe is in the latter in terms of that feeling and sound. You don't get much of any feedback from the frame, whether it's feel or the sound itself. It is relatively firm to some degree and is also overly dampened in my opinion. To me, possibly the least enjoyable in terms of touch and feel, and oddly enough I did have some lingering soreness after a couple sessions, but that could be more dependent on the strings that I used at the time. The Extreme Tour is kind of a balance of both. It's relatively firm and has its stiffness properties, but provides good feedback and produces a sound off contact that is between the other two frames. I did slightly jar my wrist from using it on a cold night with dense balls, so I'd be careful if you knowingly have problems. Other than that, it's definitely a nice switch up compared to the muted feeling rackets that most brands have been producing as of late. My recommendation is to either use a poly hybrid or a multi-filament hybrid. Using a poly hybrid string would include something along the lines of ISO Speed Cream, T1 Ghost Wire, Head Links Touch or RPM Soft, along with the choice of your main string. Again, if you're sensitive, probably stay away, but if you're still keen, I wouldn't use championship balls. I would go with extra duty balls only, despite obviously the lack of durability, but it's definitely more safe for your arm. Avoid dead balls, wet balls and cold nights, and also do not remove the original replacement grip on the VS as it serves as a dampener of vibrations as well. If you use leather, I think it becomes noticeably more harsh. For power differential is hard to tell because it also combines the varying amounts of spin potential as well. If anything, the Vcore has probably the most flattening power, with the VS a very close second. The Extreme Tour is notably considered a control frame. There is still accessible power, and I would compare it to the likes of the EZone 98. All three rackets have the ability to switch up between flat and heavy topspin balls pretty easily, so they are very versatile in shot selection. For control, it goes to the Extreme Tour because you can rip and maintain margin. When you flatten balls, it stays fairly targeted and does not spray very often at all. The shape of the frame is designed in a way that you can defend quite well even with a lack of time to set up for the ball, because it's still quite maneuverable and it allows you to block and slice comfortably when on the move. The Aero VS is no slouch either, but the lesser control comes from the extra stiffness that increases the overall pace. Not to mention that the way it's built, you get way more racket head speed, so you can sometimes mistime the swing actually because you probably swing overly fast, which may lead to overshooting because of the extra power. The Vcore with the mutedness does not feel incredibly precise. You need to spend more time to get a feel of how things behave, but the ball can shoot off the racket quite fast, and if your strings aren't as fresh as you require them to be, there's a tendency to overhit on some balls. So I would not go for pinpoint targets, nor would I with the VS unless you're in a desperate situation with little options to choose. For maneuverability, the VS is just insanely one of the fastest and whippiest rackets you can lay your hands on. It feels so easy to swing around. The swing weight is not relatively high, and without even a large wind up in a swing, you can really rip some of the balls with ease. The Extreme Tour is also fairly built for good speed, but you can feel like you get bogged down a little bit here and there. This may be more as a result of the quality control of the racket if it doesn't give you the optimal balanced swing weight that ultimately suits your playstyle. When I had the wrong setup, even by just a slight amount, it was far more subpar than when I had got it right. Obviously, it's a personal preference, so you're gonna have to use some time to experiment to find your spec. The Vcore naturally has the highest average stock swing weight, which will feel overall slower than the others, especially next to the E-Zone, where the E-Zone was feeling more like the Aero VS in terms of racket head speed, and the Vcore I had to be a little bit more switched on with timing to use it to its fullest capacity. You can definitely feel like the maneuverability is a little bit slower on the Vcore for whatever reason, even though it's supposed to be an aerodynamic shape. For one-handers out there, maneuverability wise, all three frames work quite well with the one-hander. I would say the Extreme Tour takes the cake for the one-hander. When customized, it feels a lot more solid and versatile, whilst with the VS you need to be more conscious of how to plow through the ball a little bit more, because if you pull off too fast, the stability of the racket isn't quite enough sometimes and tends to kill the ball into the net. The Vcore, even with slowdowns and maneuverability, has the power and spin potential to really move through the ball at the point of contact, so it works really well with penetration. For spin, all three rackets produce a great deal of spin for a 98, but if I were to boil it down, I'd say the VS produces the highest, the Extreme Tour a very close second, and the Vcore slightly more distant third. You just cannot beat the swing speed of the VS. It's so easy to come underneath the ball at a very high speed, and it produces just quite a considerable amount more of spin compared to the other traditional 98 square inch rackets on market like Blades, Booms, and TF40s. The Extreme Tour is just as good in terms of actual RPMs, I believe, but the extra power from the VS makes the VS more of a spin penetrating racket, whereas the Extreme Tour produces a bit more of a higher sitting ball once it makes the bounce. Your opponents will have slightly more time to read the ball after the bounce, whereas the VS will push into them more, taking considerably much more time away from them. The Vcore overall has better penetration but not necessarily as much spin as the other two. Of course it spins much better than other 98 square inch frames, but in my estimation it just doesn't seem to provide as much spin, especially when factoring in the slight clunkiness to the maneuverability. The slice in the VS has a very consistent and knifing slice capabilities. Again, due to my bias towards light and fast frames, I can really accelerate into the ball and cut right through. The Extreme Tour is also quite the same. It has fantastic control capabilities paired with its spin potential that make it easy to dig deep low balls and chomp down on high bounces. And as I mentioned in the previous review of the Vcore 98, just seemed to be the most inconsistent when I tried to slice down on the ball, tended to give me a lot more floaters, and overall I just didn't enjoy it, nor did it feel as natural to my swing path. With serves, both the Extreme and the Aero will not perform particularly well in stock form, especially if they're under-specced. They both need at least to be 323 in swing weight and above, where the Vcore already should be coming in around 325 standard, so the Vcore itself should relatively have no problems serving if quality control is quite decent. The Extreme and VS won't have enough stability at contact to penetrate the court, and that will also affect the overall control and accuracy because the racket doesn't stay facing its target once it makes contact. It will actually end up twisting and shaking a little bit. Once you've added that extra weight, then the weaknesses start to disappear, and then you're able to achieve a much higher level serve with these rackets. The VS stands out because it has some huge swing speed, so you can serve very fast flat balls but still access its core spin potential. And interesting enough, it has enough total control capabilities on the serve where I felt like I could hit any of my spots at will. The Extreme Tour shows more of its serving strength with the accuracy. You won't get as fast of a serve as the VS or the Vcore, but the spin is still great, and the accuracy is better than the others if you don't feel as automatic with your serving. The Vcore does a little bit of everything, but the control is probably the lowest in comparison between the three, and also that lack of maneuverability does show itself a little bit here as well. Again, it's not a negative factor, it really could just depend on your swing style, where it's just my serve and my forehand swing styles are very whippy, so I require the most racket head speed possible. For forgiveness, the Aero VS with the additional stiffness is the most forgiving by far, where off-center shots are not particularly jarring despite the stiffness, and mishits will end up producing those random spinny balls that partially come off the frame and still land in. The Vcore is slightly less forgiving and performs roughly the same, and is compensated by the Yonex isometric head shape to increase the forgiveness, but really does not stand out in any special way more than the other rackets. Of course, the Extreme Tour is the most difficult to use. If you string at your normal tension like you would with any other frame, you're going to find a much more forgiving response. So you should either wait for your strings to break in considerably, or string 45 pounds and lower to increase the power, sweet spot and spin potential. Then you'll virtually find that it performs just as well or easy with a racket that produces arguably better feel than the others. For stability, the Vcore in its standard swing weight is pretty solid and a stable all-rounder, but if you get any resemblance of it under spec, like getting a comparable swing weight to the E-Zone, then you'll find it's a pretty flimsy racket that shakes and twists a lot on every other shot. The Extreme Tour in stock swing weight is also likely in need of some dire weight. The frame itself is not thick enough to offset the low swing weight and simply will not allow you to penetrate or plow through the court enough. The VS is balanced with a higher stiffness, and whilst not the most stable racket by any means, it has some compensating factors that can assist, but at the minimum I would recommend a swing weight of around 321 to 323 if your VS comes in lower than 320. For volleys, the Vcore felt pretty solid on the volley end, and possibly where maneuverability did not have as much of an effect, but the muted feel does cause some kind of lack of confidence in touch and feel because it does not pocket the ball very well. The Aero VS probably lacked a little bit in stability, but it's so fast that you can get around the net so easily, and with the additional weight it does not hamper the speed at all, and I personally like the feel of the VS, and in doubles I can still execute my drop volleys and touch drop shots with relatively good precision. The Extreme Tour likewise in stock form lacked a lot of stability, and is not typically a racket I would recommend using without any customization. With the additional customization, albeit really not that much for me, it is probably the best volleying racket between the three, with the balance of maneuverability, touch, stability and feel. So who's this racket for? Quite simply, the Aero VS is for someone who uses a typical Babolat frame and is seeking to maintain some of its power and spin properties whilst looking for a bit more control. It's 100% made for the modern day swing style if you want a super high swing speed and maximum acceleration. In recent months I've been transitioning my game to add more heavy topspin and do away with the extremely aggressive flat style, and the VS has become a welcome addition to my collection. I'd say it's targeted towards mid to intermediate players all the way up to advanced players, obviously with Carlos Alcaraz using this racket. The Extreme Tour I've previously reviewed, but now I'm more experienced with rackets and I'm also a better player, albeit less healthy, but I'm far more capable of using this racket to its maximum potential than previous years. And this time around I'm able to tell how well rounded this racket is. Though it's not the easiest to use out of the three, but with the right customization of weight and string setup, you can really hone in on this racket and make it your own and get it to perform everything that you need to execute with. It's a high consideration for someone with a full modern day technique, all-round playstyle, and I would consider it mostly for high intermediate to advanced players. Now with the Vcore here, I would only think to choose out of the three if you're brand loyal, prefer the paint job, or need a control spin racket that isn't as stiff as the VS and is also more forgiving than the Extreme Tour. If I were to match pound for pound the categories I've mentioned in this review, I don't see how the Vcore would be able to compete with the other two frames. Nonetheless, not to say it's a bad frame by any means, but on a scale of similar racket types, personally it's not the one I would gravitate towards. Anyway, that concludes my review. I hope you guys are still enjoying the reviews without the extra fluff of intros and extra details. If you do, let me know in the comments. So again, if you enjoyed the video, please like it and subscribe if you haven't. Be sure to check out my racket rating comparisons at the end of the video. Thanks for watching and I'll see you guys next time.